I'm so excited to be here. Honestly, I have never given a talk, so you guys are my first, and I hope this goes well. I prayed on the drive over here. So Kelly initially gave me the topic, Framing the Battle, Toxic Feminism, and the Vision of Catholic Womanhood. And it was interesting because I was recently on the Theology of the Body retreat. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, with Christopher West. He basically takes you through a course going over John Paul II's work of theology of the body, and when the news of Roe v. Wade being overturned broke, I was there, and it was very fitting because theology of the body is, in my opinion, the work that's going to, prepare us for the next battles ahead. So I had this battle imagery in my head about this when she gave me this topic, and I was reflecting on it. Toxic feminism and the vision of Catholic womanhood. Honestly, when I was reflecting on these, and I was at Theology of the Body retreat, we were talking about Eve, we were talking about the new Eve in Mary. Now, I'm a Protestant convert, so I was never really familiar with Mary growing up, but as a convert, the more I learn about her, the more I realize she is a very wild woman. And I know that in Catholic images, we often see her as very, prayerful and meek, but it's her posture that is the archetype and the model for all of humanity for us as the church. And so I just want to go over that today and kind of use those as frameworks for us. So honestly, toxic feminism or femininity, just like the term toxic masculinity, these are not to say that feminism or femininity in and of itself is actually toxic, but it's when this becomes disordered that it becomes toxic. So when masculinity turns in on itself, it becomes toxic, just like when feminism or femininity closes itself off. So one thing that I learned that was actually really interesting is in Genesis, the word for male, one of the root words in the translation is zakar, which means to remember. So the male word is also a word that is used to mean to remember. The word for female is nikabah. So zakar is Z-A-K-A-R, in case you guys want to look this up later. And then nekavah is N-E-Q-E-B-A-H, I believe. And that means to open. So what it means is that when man remembers who he is and who he's created to be, the woman naturally opens. She's receptive. But when he forgets, she closes off. So masculinity initiates. We know this if we look at the biological reality of men. They initiate and they enter the feminine. It's meant to protect the weaker and most vulnerable, which is women and children. But when it's disordered, it is not for the other, but it's for oneself and uses the other for its own selfish pleasure and interest. Femininity is naturally receptive. This doesn't mean passive. I think when I was younger, I kind of would interpret these words to mean something in the modern pretext. But what it means is that it receives the masculine, and in that receptivity, it gives. So there is an active element, but it's usually after it has been opened and it's receiving. So it receives the child. The feminine womb is meant to house another. I think it's amazing that within your grandmother's body are the eggs of your mother, which means that you are also connected somehow through that. So your mother's womb is your first home. It's open and it's trusting in God and nature, how our bodies were formed, and also in man to not take advantage of our vulnerability. But when that vulnerability is violated, the feminine posture becomes distrusting, most especially in God, and this is where Eve ends up listening to the lies of Satan, despising her nature, and it also despises man, bearing off the wound, and finding religion in liberalism or feminism, which is the anti-religion of false liberation. So ultimately, I kind of see feminism as the posture of Eve, which is like a distrust in God and man. And it ends up being a disdain for femininity in and of itself because it measures human nature not by God's original plan and design, but by our fallen human experience. And it's a very cynical anthropology and worldview. I don't know if you guys know much of feminist rhetoric. I don't know how much you're exposed to in school if you guys go to Catholic schools or public schools. But feminists often, if you look underneath what they're saying, they simultaneously believe that men are better and worse than women. So better in that the masculine standard is what's considered standard, and then worse because women could be better men. So if you ever heard women, use the expressions like "we can do it better," it's kind of insinuating that men don't do it so well. And I think if you look at the history of feminism, especially in our country, this kind of climaxes during the women's workplace liberation movement and the sexual revolution. They basically wanted to eliminate sexual difference in the boardroom and the bedroom. So in order for women to use their gifts and talents that God gave us, they expect, in order to be leaders in society, they believe that they have to make themselves like men. So basically, not being able to get pregnant, not taking time off to raise children, working long hours, competing in the corporate world, climbing the social structure, pursue jobs dominated by men, even if that's not their natural interests. So now you see this push for female independence and careerism, and actually women are outnumbering a lot of men in college these days. There was also this sexual double standard in society. Now, I think that we can probably understand the plight of the feminists, because there was this expectation for women to remain pure, but there was not an emphasis on men. And so the feminists naturally are like, well, if you're going to impose this on me, but you're not imposing it on them, why do I even have to accept this standard to begin with for myself? But I personally think, and I think Catholic feminists would agree, that the mistake in eliminating the standard for themselves was that they lowered themselves to the worst kinds of men in order to be equal, instead of calling and expecting men to raise up and meet that challenge. So now you have this sexual dynamic where both sexes are essentially using each other. They're very distrusting of each other, and obviously contraception is being used in this capacity, because if you don't trust this person and you don't want, permanent ties to this person, why would you want to conceive a child with this person? So we see this playing out even in the dating market, which is a total mess. And so feminists ultimately, they don't trust men to take responsibility when it comes to sex. They don't trust God in the planning of their families, so they use birth control and abortion as a means to try to take back that control over their reproduction and their bodies, but it's a false illusion. And this ultimately closes women off to being receptive, which is what we as the church are meant to be. So woman is the archetype, and I think I mentioned this, the model of humanity, in that we, the church, are supposed to be receptive to Christ. We're the bride, even men, we're the bride of Christ. Christ is the bridegroom. And so if you were to ask yourself, what should the Catholic woman's posture be? I think it would be Marian. Mary trusts God. We all know about her fiat, let it be done according to thy will. That's really hard if you live that out in the world. Like, if you really trust God, that is incredibly hard, and it's incredibly brave. But I think it's the only way. And St. Catherine of Siena, you guys probably know the famous line, be who God made you to be and you'll set the world on fire. So I think as Catholic women, we have two things. So we have to figure out our unique feminine genius. You have to figure out how God made you. How did he wire you? What are the things that you're passionate about? What are you interested in? Pursue those, because I think those are going to be parts of God's plan for you. So establish these interests, these passions on your own, and really grow in your personal relationship with Christ, because that is going to be what carries you throughout life. A really great piece of reading that you guys can start with is John Paul II's letter to women. A lot of people also read Edith Stein, Alice von Hildebrand. They're kind of more classic feminine works, but there's also really great modern Catholic thinkers. In DC, there's Dr. Helen Alvarez. She speaks a lot in the pro-life movement. There's Erica Bacchiacchi. She recently wrote a book on the rights of women from a Catholic perspective. There's Carrie Gress. She has 2 really great books. And there's also Abigail Favell. So she was a postmodern feminist, and she converted to Catholicism, so now she speaks on behalf of a Catholic vision of feminism. So number 1 is figuring out your unique feminine genius. I personally think that becoming Catholic, one thing that massively changed for me was I was seeing my vocation as more important than my profession. I think profession should be secondary, but I think the mistake our world makes is in a lot of schools, everybody's emphasizing on your career and what you're going to do, what you're going to study, where you're going to work. That's great. I'm not saying to not pursue that, but as Catholics, we do have this thing called vocation, and a lot of people are either most people are called to marriage, unless you feel called to religious life. And so I would pursue those as much as you pursue your professional goals. And I was thinking about, because I always like incorporating characters. I'm a huge Anne Shirley fan. I don't know if any of you guys were at the last talk, but I brought up Gilbert Blythe, and like every girl like me when I was younger, like freaked out about it. But we're not talking about men today, so I'm not going to bring up Gilbert. And I love Anne, but a few characters that I just wanted to kind of throw in here as like maybe inspiration for you, because I love stories, I love reading, I love movies. So I have a YouTube channel, and one of the videos I made was on Victorian feminism. So I say, okay, so women have these uniquely female attributes, such as giving birth, being open to life, housing life in their bodies. So we have to respect that difference of female nature, but we also have individual, unique feminine genius. And so Queen Victoria was kind of this interesting figure. You should watch the Young Victoria and the Victoria series. She has a great traditional marriage with Prince Albert. She has 9 kids, but she's also ruler of a great empire, and it's like the pinnacle of English history. So I used her as an example of kind of how to like balance these two ideas. And then I also wanted to bring up Jane Eyre, because I think one thing, if I was younger, I wish people would have told me was the natural effect that women's virtue has on men. So I love Anne of Green Gables because Gilbert Blythe is virtuous. But in a lot of literature, you'll find, I'm going to use the example of Jane Eyre, you'll find that the woman's virtue often inspires the man to become the man that is worthy of her. And so there's this great, when they're having this, there's a scene where he wants, basically, I'll give you the brief story. Basically, she's a governess, he is the lord of the manor, they fall in love, they want to get married, but he has a secret. So he has this wife who is mad and crazy, and she's in the attic, and so they can't technically get married. And of course, he has his reasons for wanting to still be with Jane, and so he tells her, you can be my mistress. Well, she refuses because she finds that degrading not only for him and for her, but also for the wife. And so she does the right thing and she walks away. And she has this great line. She says, "The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad as I am now. Laws and principles are not for times when there is no temptation, for they are for moments such as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Strignant as they are, inviolate they shall be. If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I have always believed, and if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. Preconceived opinions, foregone determinations, all I have at this hour is to stand. There I plant my foot." So she tells him no, and he says, so you want me to be miserable and die alone? And she says, "I advise you to live sinless, and I wish you to die tranquil." And so she has this standard, she walks away, and then she ends up, basically, the wife ends up, she's an arsonist, she ends up setting fire to the house and jumps off the roof, and Rochester goes to try to save her. And in the process, he ends up becoming blind and losing an arm. But it is through the suffering that he actually becomes a man worthy of Jane. And so by the end of the novel, when they finally reconnect, he's actually, through his suffering, has attained the virtue required to be together. And it was because she said no that they ultimately can actually be happy in the end. So my advice to you is, no matter what this world throws at you, and there will be plenty of temptations to abandon this walk and this journey with Christ, always stand true to your convictions, because I really do believe that God has the best things in store for you. Okay, that's it.
I love that Jane Eyre quote. I was not familiar with that one.
Yeah, it's so good, honestly.
I read her years ago, but I was.
It's okay if you watch. Yeah, it's a little depressing because it's all about suffering. But if you watch it with like a different perspective, you can see the beauty in it. So. Yeah.
Any of you ladies have any questions for Jessica pertaining to what she spoke about, or her own personal journey, kind of navigating the world as a woman of Christ?
It's okay. Are you guys enjoying camp? This is really beautiful. The drive down here was so